Welcome back to State of Valor. The parking lot was empty except for her, 15 years old, alone under a flickering gas station light, $8 in her hand, and a dog sitting so close to her leg that she could feel the warmth of him through her jeans. The night was the kind of cold that doesn't move, the kind that just sits on your shoulders and stays there. Emily Carter stood very still, staring down at the money like she was trying to make peace with something she already knew she couldn't change. $8, that was all that was left. Not just in her pocket, in the house, in every drawer and coat lining and old coffee can on the kitchen shelf that her mother checked when things got bad. $8 for breakfast tomorrow morning, for the two of them. That was the whole plan. That was the entire future sitting in her 16-year-old hand on a cold Thursday night outside a gas station on Route 9. Beside her, Titan didn't move. He was a Belgian Malinois, big and dark-coated, with eyes that looked like they had seen more of the world than most people ever would. He had been trained by the United States military. He had served in places Emily could barely find on a map. He had worked alongside a man who taught him every command he knew, who fed him and trusted him and brought him home. And then 3 years ago, that man had gone somewhere Titan couldn't follow. And ever since, without being asked, without hesitation, the dog had simply transferred everything, every ounce of loyalty, every instinct, every quiet, watchful hour of the night. He had given it all to the daughter and the wife his soldier had left behind. Emily reached down and touched the top of his head. He leaned into her hand without taking his eyes off the parking lot. That was when the man came around the corner. He was big, broad across the shoulders, the kind of build that told you he had been strong once and still carried the memory of it in his frame, even if the years had taken some of the edge off. He was moving along the side of the building with one hand trailing the brick wall, and even from a distance, Emily could see that something was wrong. His steps were too careful, his jaw was too tight, there was sweat on his face that didn't belong on a cold night. He made it 4 steps into the parking lot. Then his hand came up to his chest, and he went down. Not slowly, not the way people fall in movies, with time to reach out and catch something. He collapsed the way a structure collapses when the thing holding it up finally gives, completely, all at once, his knees hitting the pavement, and then his shoulder, and then he was on his side under the parking lot lights, with one hand pressed flat against his chest and his breathing coming in wrong. Someone inside the gas station shouted. A woman near the door froze with her hand over her mouth. A man by the pumps pulled out his phone and stood there holding it, not dialing, just holding it, staring. Emily stood still for 3 seconds. 3 seconds where everything in her body was telling her she was 15 and alone, and she didn't know what to do, and she only had $8, and someone else would handle this, someone older, someone who knew more, someone who was supposed to be in charge of situations like this one. 3 seconds. And then she heard her father's voice. Not out loud, not from anywhere around her, from the place inside her where she had been storing him for 3 years. Every word he had ever said to her, every quiet thing he had told her at the kitchen table, or on the drive to school, or in the doorway of her room at night when he thought she was already asleep. His voice was low and steady the way it always was. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared, Em. It means you help anyway. Emily's hand closed around the $8. She ran. Through the gas station door, past the frozen woman, straight to the back corner shelf. Aspirin. She grabbed it without stopping. Water. She grabbed that too. She moved to the counter and put both down, and looked at the cashier and said, "There is a man outside who just collapsed. Call 911 right now, please. Right now." Her voice came out steadier than she felt, steadier than she had any right to expect. The cashier reached for the phone. "How much?" Emily asked. He told her, $8. She put every bill on the counter, all of it, every crumpled single in the 5 underneath, everything she had, everything that was supposed to be tomorrow's breakfast. She put it down without looking at it again and picked up the aspirin and the water and walked back outside. He was still on the ground. She knelt beside him on the cold concrete, and her knees pressed into the pavement, and she opened the aspirin, and her hands were shaking now that the decision had already been made, and there was nothing left to be brave about except staying. "Sir," she leaned close. "Sir, can you hear me?" His eyes opened, slow and unfocused, moving without landing anywhere, and then gradually, like something coming up from underwater, they found her face. "I need you to chew this," she said softly, holding the aspirin forward. "Please, just chew it for me." He did, slowly, barely, but he did. She helped him sip the water. She kept her hand near his shoulder so he knew someone was there. She kept talking to him in that low, steady voice because she remembered somewhere some fragment of something her father had told her once about staying conscious, about the sound of a voice being an anchor when everything else is going dark. "Help is coming," she told him. "You're going to be okay. I just need you to keep breathing. Stay with me. Keep breathing." Titan had followed her. He stood a few feet back, watching the man on the ground with that complete and total focus that was the thing about him that had always made Emily feel both safe and slightly awed. And then he began to move closer, slowly, one step at a time. His nose dropped toward the man's jacket, toward the collar, toward the worn patch of fabric near the left shoulder, and he began to smell the way he smelled things that mattered, deep and deliberate and completely still everywhere except his nose. Emily watched him. She had seen Titan alert before. She had seen him protective and focused and locked on to something, but she had never seen him look like this. His whole body had changed. The muscles along his back had gone rigid. His breathing had slowed. And then, from somewhere deep inside him, came a sound she had never heard from him in 3 years. A soft whine, low and broken and brief, like something recognizing something it had given up believing it would ever find again. The man's eyes drifted toward the dog. The siren was getting louder somewhere in the dark. And then the man's lips moved, cracked and dry and barely audible, but they moved. "Titan," he whispered. The dog sat, instantly, completely, back straight, eyes forward, perfectly still in the way that had nothing to do with being a pet and everything to do with being a soldier, responding to the voice of someone with authority, someone he knew, someone his whole body remembered, even when his eyes hadn't seen them in years. Emily stopped breathing. She looked at the man. She looked at Titan. The siren turned into the parking lot. At the hospital, they made her wait in the hallway. She was 15 and alone, and they were kind about it but firm, and she sat in a plastic chair with Titan pressed hard against her legs, and she waited. She didn't call her mother, not yet. Her mother was working the second of her 2 jobs, and Emily didn't want to pull her away until there was something real to say. So she sat, and she waited, and she thought about the way Titan had said that name, and about the command, and about the perfectly straight spine of a dog responding to a voice out of his past. An hour passed, maybe longer. Then footsteps came down the hallway. Slow and deliberate. A man in a hospital gown moving carefully. One hand steadying himself against the wall, an IV line taped to the back of his hand. He was upright now, and the color had come back into his face, but his eyes, when they found Emily across the waiting room, were carrying something that had nothing to do with the heart attack, something older than that, something that had been sitting inside him for a long time, waiting for exactly this moment. He lowered himself into the chair across from her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Titan raised his head and looked at the man steadily. "Jack," the man said. "Jack Donovan." He paused. Retired Navy SEAL. Another pause. And I need to ask you something. His voice was careful, in the way that voices get careful when a person is approaching something they are almost afraid to confirm. What's your last name? Emily looked at him. Carter, she said. Emily Carter. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing she had ever sat inside. Jack Donovan closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. Commander Michael Carter, he said, so quiet it was almost to himself. He was my father, Emily said. Jack looked down at his hands. For a long time, he just looked at his hands. And when he finally looked up, his jaw was tight, and his voice had that particular roughness that comes into a man's voice when he has been holding something back for years, and the walls are finally coming down, whether he planned for them to or not. Your father saved my life, he said, on a mission a long time ago. Things went wrong fast, the way things do, and your father didn't think about it, didn't hesitate, didn't weigh the options. He just moved, put himself between me and something I was not going to survive. Jack shook his head slowly, and he never said a word about it afterward, never brought it up, never asked for anything, just went back to work like it was nothing. His voice dropped lower. I thought about him every single day after I heard he was gone, and I never got to tell him. Emily didn't speak. There were no words that fit.
Titan stood up slowly from beside her chair, walked the 3 steps across to Jack Donovan, and placed his head gently, carefully, on the man's knee. Jack looked down at the dog. His hand came up and rested on Titan's head. And they stayed like that, the old soldier and the dog who had never stopped remembering, in the quiet of that hospital hallway, held together by a man who was gone, but somehow still present in all of it, still present in the dog's loyalty, still present in his daughter's steady voice in a cold parking lot, still present in the fact that out of every gas station, on every road in that town, Jack Donovan had collapsed in front of the one place where the right person was standing. 3 days later, Emily woke to the sound of engines. She lay still and listened, certain she had imagined it. Then she heard voices outside, low and unhurried. She got up and went to the window. The street was lined with trucks, and the men climbing out of them were not young. They were men in their 50s and 60s, with gray at their temples and quiet in their movements. The kind of quiet that comes from having done serious things in serious places, and having learned that the most important work in life rarely requires an audience. They carried toolboxes and paint and lumber, and they moved toward her house with the calm, purposeful energy of people who have already decided what needs to be done and are simply doing it. Emily heard her mother's voice from down the hall. She heard it change. She had heard her mother's voice every morning for 3 years. She had heard it tired, and she had heard it forced cheerful, and she had heard it thin with the particular exhaustion of a woman who works 2 jobs and pays late rent and holds herself together every single day because there is a daughter watching, and the daughter cannot see her break. Emily knew every version of her mother's voice. She had never heard it make the sound it made when Sarah Carter opened the front door and saw what was in the street. It was not crying exactly. It was something that came before crying, something that comes out of a person when they have been strong for so long that the simple sight of not having to be strong anymore is more than the body knows how to hold quietly. Jack stepped forward from the group. Mrs. Carter, he said, my name is Jack Donovan. Your husband saved my life, and I am so sorry it took me this long to find you. Sarah Carter stood in the doorway with one hand pressed over her mouth and tears running down her face, and she nodded, because it was the only thing she could do. Because some things are too large for words, and the only honest response is just to let them land. They stayed for 3 days. They fixed the roof, they repaired the furnace that had been failing since February, they painted the porch, they sat at the kitchen table with the stack of bills that had been living on the counter like a second presence in the house, and they made it disappear. They did all of it without ceremony and without making anyone feel small for having needed it. Because that is what that brotherhood does. It doesn't ask if you need help. It just shows up and helps. On the last night, they gathered in the living room. Nobody organized it. Nobody announced it. They simply drifted, one by one, toward the wall where the photograph had hung for 3 years. Commander Michael Carter, in his dress uniform, his eyes looking directly at the camera, his expression carrying that combination of strength and gentleness that Emily had spent 3 years trying to hold perfectly still in her memory, terrified of the morning she might wake up and find it had blurred. One by one, the veterans raised their right hands, a slow and silent salute. No words, no performance, just men who had loved another man standing in his home and telling him in the only language that had ever truly fit between soldiers that he was not forgotten, that he would never be forgotten, that the things he had done and the way he had lived and the family he had loved were still here, still standing, still being looked after. Emily felt the tears fall and did not try to stop them. And then she saw Titan. He had moved without anyone noticing. He stood now directly beneath the photograph, looking at it with those dark and steady eyes, and slowly, with the quiet certainty that had always made him seem like he understood things the rest of them were still working out, he sat down, back straight, eyes up, perfectly still. The way he had sat during ceremonies, the way he had sat in the field when the mission was complete, and the team was together, and the world was briefly, blessedly, exactly as it should be. His soldier was gone, but Titan was still at his post, still standing guard. Emily stood in that room for a long time, looking at him, at the dog and the photograph and the line of gray-haired men with their hands raised in the lamplight, and she thought about $8, about holding them in a cold parking lot and feeling the weight of tomorrow in them, about spending them anyway because a voice she loved had told her once that bravery is not the absence of fear, it is the choice to help, even when it costs everything you have. Even when the night is cold and the person on the ground is a stranger and there is no way of knowing whether any of it will mean anything at all. She hadn't known who Jack Donovan was when she knelt beside him on that pavement. She hadn't known what $8 would set into motion. She had only known what her father taught her. You help anyway. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the world answers. Sometimes the brotherhood finds its way home. Sometimes an old dog looks up at a photograph on a wall and in his stillness says everything the rest of us are still searching for the words to say. Honor the ones who served, take care of the families they left behind, and never underestimate what a single act of courage from even the smallest and most unlikely of hands can set into motion in this world. If this story reached something in you, if it reminded you of a father, a veteran, a family that gave everything quietly and asked nothing back, leave a comment below. Tell us who you're thinking of right now. We read every single one.
Subscribe to State of Valor, hit that bell, because every week we come back here for the ones who never stopped serving even after the mission ended. This is State of Valor, and we will never stop telling these stories.